Bom, depois da contribuição das painelistas, que nós agradecemos, desses debates ricos e provocadores, damos continuidade ao seminário. Por favor, eu pediria que todos e todas se acomodassem para que a gente pudesse dar continuidade. Agora teremos a palestra 2, Juventude e a Cultura da Violência contra as Mulheres. Para ministrar essa palestra, convidamos Marai Larasi, que atua no enfrentamento à violência contra mulheres e adolescentes em grupos marginalizados e é presidente-adjunta da End Violence Against Women Coalition.
Greetings, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this amazing event. That panel session, in particular, makes me feel very much at home, knowing that our political hearts are so connected. I want to offer huge acknowledgement to the organizers, to each person, each agency and institute for having this seminar happen. I also acknowledge you as the Brazilian people for the changes you've made in your country and for your commitment to ending violence against women and girls and to the advancement of human rights more broadly. Now, in the UK, when we say we are having a seminar, it usually involves 20 to 50 people. This is not a seminar where I come from. This is a conference, right? So, you know, it's really great to be in Brazil, and I just want to acknowledge all of you. But because of who I am, it's also important that I offer specific respect to the indigenous peoples of this land and this particular area, and also honor your ancestors. I also offer from my heart and my soul acknowledgement within this space to the Black peoples of Brazil, in honor of our shared ancestral pathways and connected journeys, Africa, enslavement and survival. So where I am from, part of how you connect to people is by connecting to a family or to an area, a shared place, or a friend, or so forth. So I have to tell you just a little bit about me because that informs how I think about the world. I was born in the UK, my parents are Jamaican, so not too far away. And my mother had the wisdom to make sure that I was raised in Jamaica. I'm a child of the mountains, of red dirt, the kind of dirt that you can never really wash away. And my ancestry is complicated with legacies of colonization. So it was great to hear colonization mentioned because I was wondering how I could be in Brazil and not hear people talk about colonization. So my ancestry is complicated through those histories. And so I'm the descendant of enslaved Africans and also of Scottish, English, and Welsh colonizers. That legacy is carried in this body and in my psyche. It's a source of strength and also a source of pain. I share with you today from my own Black feminist perspectives, and sometimes people wonder if that's possible. My perspective is practice-based with specific theoretical groundings, but I speak here from a place of sharing, of communities of women, informed and in some cases led by the young woman. I'm not a young woman, so to speak about youth, there's a bit of a challenge there, right? But I'm going to try to speak from some of the perspectives of the young woman and of the young men who trust me and others with their ideas, their experiences, their thoughts, and their hopes. And as someone coming from communities that are often overly researched and studied as the other or as exotic, I also take responsibility for my privilege that I hold here in representing some of these ideas. I don't take that lightly. And although I've worked in different geographical spaces, I'm going to speak to you mainly from a UK perspective. I'm going to speak on some of the issues and challenges, but also will reference some of the work that is happening. I focus on young people, thinking about the very specific ways that the girl child is made vulnerable, as a girl and as a child. A very wise young person said to me, "This society doesn't love young people." And I hope that Brazil is a society that loves young people. Just to offer a trigger warning, some of the material that I'll speak about, some of the references could be upsetting in terms of personal experiences. So I just want to flag that up. Okay, let's see if this works. Okay. It's not doing it. Can I have some tech help at all? Yes, fantastic. So we've had people talk about violence against women and girls today. It's perpetrated in different ways across the world, women and girls. And I say women and girls because sometimes when we say woman, we think we're talking about girls. The girl child has a different set of experiences sometimes, and it's important that we understand that. But women and girls are subjected to sexual abuse and exploitation, rape, torture, physical assault, psychological abuse, female genital mutilation, forced marriage, financial abuse, harassment, violence perpetrated in the name of honor, stalking, and more. And as Laurie said earlier, sometimes we want to think of things with those strands, but the picture is often a lot more complicated. For many women and girls, this violence is not an aberration. It's the norm. It's part of their everyday experience. And while violence has been historically understood as occurring within the private or public sphere, women and girls are now negotiating new threats and experiences of abuse within the virtual space. In addition, the commodification of women's and girls' bodies has facilitated the emergence of whole industries in which men's right to pleasure and entertainment is routinely prioritized over women's bodily integrity, safety, well-being, and freedom. So I would say that's pretty cultural, right? So it's great that this conversation is a conversation about cultures of violence, because cultures are not static. They're dynamic. Even deeply entrenched positions can be transformed. So when we talk about violence against women and girls, it's important that we think about this thing of disproportionality. Violence affects us because we are women and girls, not they, in my case, we. And it's a great starting point, because it's essential that when we think about women and girls, that we do not ignore the reality that societies are complicated, stratified structures. So to deconstruct this space of inequality, we have to think about the intersections with other sites of oppression. Race, sexuality, disability, and we cannot ignore, for example, the debilitating effect of colonization and the ongoing legacies of racism. So thanks to Louisa for introducing this conversation. I wish I could say that the world looked different outside of Brazil. We also cannot ignore something like the effects of homophobia. For example, there may be specific ways that a woman is targeted if she's a lesbian, and if she's a lesbian from a particular community. And if we do not consider the ways that her body may be targeted for sexual or physical violence, then we will not take appropriate measures to prevent, to actually support her, to actually reach out to her in a crisis. When we think about the context in which violence occurs, there's some useful things to consider. People spoke about this earlier: well-established beliefs and norms, legislative frameworks which support gender imbalances. Now we're grappling with this idea of free speech. Free speech, which is so critical to us, is being used by perpetrators to actually support their right to abuse people online. We should think about media messaging. We should think about militarism. We should think about economic equality. And it's worth thinking, when we think about preventing violence against women and girls, that we do have international frameworks. There is a context. We have Beijing Platform for Action. We've got Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women. We have CEDAW. And sometimes we operate as if as if we actually don't have these reference points. Crucially, and I really want us to think about this, violence against women and girls, although it is prevalent, is not inevitable. And I know people have said that today, but just imagine what it would look like if we actually stopped violence against women and girls. What I know is that even some of the most committed feminist activists forget the dream, forget what we're talking about. Now, Laurie already kind of presented an ecological model. This is a model that was developed by an academic called Carol Hegeman White. I'm not going to go into it because I think Laura's analysis was quite useful, but just to say, this is quite similar. Except what's missing from much of the thinking about causes and context around violence against women and girls is the colonization of whole peoples, the impact on indigenous peoples, on black people. What does that do to the formation of masculinity? So it's great to hear that from Louisa and Rita earlier. Okay. When I'm talking about prevention, just to say that this is a definition, and Laurie participated in this conversation, coming from an expert group meeting on prevention of violence against women and girls that was held in Bangkok, a UN women-led conversation. So today I'm talking about preventing violence against women and girls before it occurs, by identifying and addressing the underlying causes and promoting shifts in the social environment that ultimately reduce the number of incidences of violence against women and girls. And that is to be distinguished from the interventions that we sometimes will carry out. So, for example, if people are doing work in shelters, we might know that actually a woman has been harmed and we intervene to make sure that that doesn't happen. Or if we're doing specific group work, for example, with men to stop them from continuing their violence. This is really getting to the thing underneath. So, let's have a think about the world that girls live in. So, worldwide, more than 700 million women alive today were married as children. And in this case, below 18 years of age. More than 1 in 3, or some 250 million women, were married before the age of 15. That should be a figure that is staggering. For many of us doing this work, it's unsurprising, but it's still upsetting. In the UK, 1 in 3 girls experience unwanted sexual touching at school. And that doesn't seem to be connected to any specific geographical phenomenon or to class or ethnicity. More than 133 million girls and women have experienced some form of female genital mutilation. And that figure doesn't actually start to think about and explore what it's like for girls who have to, or young women, who go through some kind of surgical process in terms of making their body more acceptable. So what does it mean if what we're doing is we're talking about cosmetic processes? Around 120 million girls worldwide, slightly more than 1 in 10, have experienced forced intercourse or other forced sexual acts at some point in their lives. And 1 in 3 teenage girls in England experience sexual violence from a partner. And a colleague earlier mentioned sexting. So the whole idea of sending explicit images or having particular conversations, kind of via mobile phone. It's useful to think about this because sometimes we bring a particular analysis as adults that we sometimes think about, in some cases, an equal sharing of a sexual conversation. But actually, very often, sexting is coercive, and it's linked to harassment, bullying, and even to physical violence. So the world has changed, and I believe Louisa is right. The enemy is showing his face. The difference is that for many black people and indigenous people, black and indigenous women, we have always seen the enemy's face. We've never had a moment where we weren't looking in the enemy's face. Patterns have changed. Nothing could have prepared me for the abuse that is inflicted on women in the virtual space. So when I started this work 20 years ago, we didn't have Facebook. So let's think about this wider culture of violence against women and girls. One of the challenges is that narratives around violence against women have sometimes emerged with the idea of adult partners in a heteronormative, arguable Western model. And we have to think about the reality that young women, young girls, are experiencing violence from their teenage partners now. Young women are also the target of violence from adults, including those that they should be able to trust. And it's critical that we think about that, because if we are thinking about approaches to prevention that are focused on what we do to have young people not become violent as adults, or what we do to actually stop young women from experiencing violence 10 years from now, we're not completely getting it right, because actually young people are negotiating violence as we speak. And so it's quite important that we think, which is why it was great to hear Laurie say, let's start early. It's really important that we think about what do we need to do now on the basis that actually the landscape looks different, the terrain has changed. And it's not to say that young women weren't always being abused, but certainly the virtual space has completely changed the landscape for us. So, some points of concern or reflection. Construction of gender roles and messages associated with this. So what does masculinity look like in Brazil? What does it look like in Sao Paulo? What does it look like on the streets versus in the local government offices? How do these constructions and messages intersect with other critical issues, for example, race? What are we teaching young people about key issues such as consent, including sexual consent? I mean, it's interesting, as a group of adults, can you put your hand up if you feel that you really understand consent, sexual consent? Do people understand sexual consent? People are comfortable? Do we have conversations with young people about sexual consent when it's not relating to a stranger? One of the things that we know is, in terms of our feminist activism, we really got the messages home to young people about stranger danger. There's some things that we missed out in terms of what happens when you love the person. What happens if you're 12 years old and you've fallen in love with this person who is 25, who is 30, and you think that this person is the best thing that could have ever happened to you? What kind of conversations do we have about consent with that 12-year-old girl? Have we caught up with the different landscapes? Who's over 25? Right. Who uses Facebook? Yay! Who uses Twitter? Okay, Brazil's rocking. Right. Okay. But one of the things that, sometimes if you're over 25 or, or over 30, actually the digital thing doesn't make that much sense. And so when we're talking to parents about keeping their children safe, the children are locking them out of the computer before they have a chance to get near putting the parental controls in. So it's worth thinking about that. Have we caught up? Okay. So, who plays video games? Great, some gamers in the room. Who has children who play video games? Okay. Everybody know about Grand Theft Auto? Okay. So, Grand Theft Auto is really interesting as a game. In Grand Theft Auto, you've had women in prostitution since Grand Theft Auto 3. They're mainly on the streets, and if you use a woman in this way, it means that your health gets raised to more than 100%. You do have to pay her, but you can kill her and you can take the money back. That's a video game. And by the way, if you complete the pimping missions in Grand Theft Auto, the woman will pay you instead. That's a Brazilian ad. Who remembers that? It's for Kia. And it's got this whole scene where you have this child who is in a classroom with a girl child with a male teacher. And what you then have is this is an award-winning poster, by the way. What you then have is the whole scene changing, where actually she becomes a teenager and he becomes quite a lecherous adult teacher. Have people seen that? Okay. So this created huge debates in Europe. It was called the racist chair. What do you see? So it's a chair with a black mannequin that people for a long time thought was an actual real woman. So she's in this subjugated position with a white woman sitting there. And some of the points that Louisa raised earlier can be difficult to swallow. But this is complicated terrain. Black women's bodies are not just subjugated by black men or white men. They're also subjugated sometimes by white women. Who know Blurred Lines? Was Blurred Lines a hit here? Yeah, does everybody know Blurred Lines? Hands up. Okay. Right, so this was like the hit a couple of years ago in North America, all across Europe, etc. And it certainly went down very well in the Caribbean. When there was an analysis done about the lyrics, one of the things that it was recognized was actually the song sounded like it was all about rape. This is what many young people will be listening to, or a version of this. It's important, you know, in terms of knowing your enemy, understand that the enemy looks slightly different now. Social media is wonderful, but it's also created something different. The music industry is amazing, but it offers us people like Robin Thicke, who think it's okay to actually use lyrics that sound like rape lyrics. So, to the right there, one of the things about understanding why it's important to think about race, black women's experience of sexism is often racialized, and our experience of racism is often sexualized. So while all women are routinely objectified in media spaces, black women's bodies are often presented in ways that promote ideas of black hypersexuality and bestiality. In this sense, black women are not only connected to their white counterparts through the lens of sexism, but are also connected to black men in that black bodies are deployed in the media in common sense and Eurocentric historical accounts as animal-like. And you can't see that video clip clearly, but if you, just a trigger warning, it's quite an upsetting video, but if it's from Calvin Harris drinking from the bottle. That not-so-wonderful man down there in the bottom is a pornographer called Max Hardcore, and my colleague from the UK, Roz, is going to speak a bit about pornography, so I'm not going to talk too much about him. But he has become famous because he's a producer of what is called gonzo pornography, the most hardcore pornography that you can find. Now, kind of a couple of decades ago, gonzo pornography was on the sidelines. It's now mainstream. And one of the things to be mindful of, if you have children and young people, is how accessible this kind of material is. It's actually 2 clicks. It's seconds away. And sometimes when people argue with us, they say you have to really search for it. You don't. You don't have to do any major search. This man, actually, he's become famous because he produces films in which he usually stars, where he routinely punishes women's bodies, mainly focused on things like anal rape, urinating all over women, etc. Now, the women who are in the films are said to usually be over 18, but very often they're dressed up to look like they're 12, 13, 14. That's the world that young people live in. Or versions of that. There are different versions of that in different spaces, but one of the things that we know, and I remember kind of going into the Pacific and having conversations in Papua New Guinea with a colleague who was saying, surely it's not as bad as that, and then I spoke to the young people and it was a different message, because they knew some of this stuff. Okay, and this is useful in terms of thinking about how this impacts young people. So that's just some perspectives. A workshop participant said, it makes out that women are portrayed in pornography, the way that women are portrayed is correct, and that women can be treated this way. It offers a sense of entitlement. You might go up to a girl and just grab her boob, her breast, because you feel that you can. That's from a young person. An 18-year-old young woman said, often some of the young people involved don't even know that they are at risk of being exploited or are being exploited. Also, sexual exploitation is a very sensitive subject. And a project worker on one of the schemes said, there are really worrying low levels of understanding of what consent is in the context of relationships and what impacts on somebody's ability to give consent. I think almost it would be just as valuable to go around and just do sessions on what is consent. So I hope I've kind of given you a sense of why we need to think about prevention. This is a card from an End Violence Against Women Coalition piece of work that was done about 4 years ago, just reminding us that a different world is possible. And I'd like you to, for the next few minutes, just stay focused on the possibility of a different world. So again, Laurie raised some of the the ways that we can actually think about creating cultural shifts. You know, I like to think about them as spaces for action. Now, we know that prevention has routinely been deprioritized in terms of violence against women and girls' work. And we know that very often that's because we were too busy cleaning up the mess. We were too busy providing crisis services and going, how can we support this woman to make herself safe, and how can we stop this man from harming her? So we very often didn't have the opportunity to step back and go, if we had all the resources in the world, how would we stop this from happening? And the work that's been done over the last few years, and it's, again, to mention Laurie's name again, really great to hear that acknowledgement that some of this thinking is coming out of what you'd call lower income countries. So spaces for action, community-based work, which is targeted at adults, including parenting programs, supporting people to think about how they teach their children about gender. You know, that really great kind of image Nadine had earlier with, you know, kind of genders here and not there, how you have those conversations. Work in schools framed within a whole school approach. So not a situation where you're just going and doing a session in one classroom once every 6 months. How you start to have everybody in a school thinking about what does gender equality look like, and how do we have conversations about violence against women and girls. Community-based programs led by young people, targeted at young people. So, you know, like, I feel like a bit of a fraud standing here because I'm like midway through my 40s. But there is something, so there's something about recognizing that actually we have to resource young people's leadership around this work. It cannot just be us, the usual suspects, having conversations with each other. We can't keep doing that. We have to think about how we talk to young people, how we support young people so that they can talk to each other. We also need to think about the activities which are focused on things like addressing media sexism, you know, looking at our laws, etc. So just a few examples coming from the UK. And the ones in purple are the ones that have been independently evaluated. So, Female Genital Mutilation Initiative. So this is really interesting as an initiative, and you may have similar examples here. What we had was a group of funders, a group of philanthropic organizations coming together to actually look at how they could support activities that would prevent female genital mutilation from happening. Now, in terms of the evaluation, again, we don't have lots of longitudinal data. What we have is we've got information coming from people relatively recently. But what we've heard is that where community-based preventative work is taking place, rejection of female genital mutilation has increased. Funded projects have increased their understanding of what works in terms of tackling female genital mutilation. And this is really interesting. The work with younger women to empower them to speak out and make decisions has been more effective than trying to change the often deeply entrenched opinions of older people. Any surprises there? Okay. The other kind of project to talk about, Tender. Now, this is interesting because this is a schools-based project where young people explore gender stereotypes such as the submissive woman, the aggressive man, the nagging woman, you know, and they're encouraged to think about the ways that power operates in society. They're encouraged to break down commonly held beliefs, so things which excuse violence against women and girls. And young people are then asked to be responsible for defining healthy and respectful interactions. The project looked at inequality in relationships and also had conversations about what's violent and what isn't violent. Again, really difficult in terms of saying what does that look like 5 years from now. But 91% of the teachers reported positive changes in their students. Ashiana project. And that's a female forced marriage project, which I haven't put up there. But I just want to say something about that. So they did work in schools. And what they did was they went in, had conversations with young people. But what they also did was they located that work in that community-based approach. And what shifted around that thinking was young women themselves felt more empowered to have conversations about community pressure, consent, etc. The teachers, the people in the school felt more informed, more able to intervene, more able to have conversations with young women, more able to say this is not okay. And critically, because the messages were going out to parents, actually what that did was that stopped a number of forced marriages from happening. And it's useful to think about how we don't just intervene there or there or there, but how, as far as possible, we can actually have this embedded in the way that we work around violence against women and girls, the way that we do our equality work. So, just to think about that then, what could principled prevention look like? One of the things that we have huge anxieties about is how do we do work around prevention in ways that doesn't take money away from crisis services? We still need shelters. We still need services for victims of rape. We still need to make sure that people in crisis have somewhere to go. So for the people that have the lobbying power in this country, for the activists, for the campaigners, when you're having this conversation, if you haven't done so already, please have the conversation from the perspective of take money out of your military budget, not out of the budget that's already kind of going on women's services. You know, take money from somewhere else, not from the services that's needed. One size really does not fit all. And we've learned this in the UK. Again, to have that conversation about intersectionality. If you go in and you try to do work that's purely about gender, and you don't talk about something like homophobia, what does that mean for a young woman who's a lesbian, a young woman who's bisexual? It means that actually you're not even beginning to think about what that means in terms of her specific experience. If you're not talking about race and ethnicity and different cultural contexts, what you might find yourself doing is getting it completely wrong. If you have one model that says that family looks like this, 2.5 children, half a dog and a picket fence, then actually what you might not do is actually think about what family looks like for somebody like me, who has a huge extended family and where everybody gets involved in the decision making. So when you think about prevention, what you have to do is think about the different contexts in which people are living. It's really important that we don't lose, and I have this up there because I live in a situation, I know this is being streamed, so I'm going to probably piss my government off, but my government is threatening to take away the Human Rights Act. And we go around as a UK and we tell people what to do in their countries, and we resource human rights activities while we threaten to take the human rights legislation away in our own state. A human rights approach is critical because a rights-based approach, rather than simple healthy relationships approach, actually grounds the conversation in a very different way. We start to think about equality, we start to think about human rights. And this is somewhat controversial, the other point. So I want to work alongside men and boys, but I don't want men to hijack the agenda. And there's a way that over the last few years, if I go into a room and I have a conversation, people go, yeah, she's a feminist. She's going to say that. And then when a particular man might come in the room and have the conversation, we clap and we defer to him because we are so grateful that he started to talk about patriarchy. Well, boo-hoo. You know, actually what I want is I want men to take responsibility and leadership, but I want it to be done alongside us. I want men doing this work to acknowledge the feminist training they've had. I want them to acknowledge the legacies that they've inherited. And I want women who are actually working with pro-feminist men to stop deferring to the pro-feminist men and actually retain our sisterhood. And that's not a denial of the importance of the conversation about men. but it has to be, let's not reproduce the same thing that we're trying to challenge in terms of how we're then doing the work. And the other thing, which sounds a bit therapeutic, and I'm not a therapist, is that we need to be reflective. We need to think about what we're doing, how we're doing it, and where we hold privilege. It's not sufficient to simply have a conversation and not look at our own power. So the End Violence Against Women Coalition did an analysis of what promising practices could look like. And what we came up with, and that was really based, it was adapted from what used to be UN Women, UNIFEM, and ActionAid. So based on a gendered and human rights approach, evidence-based, also contributed to existing knowledge. And evidence-based is important because it can't be evidence that only values a Eurocentric knowing. It has to be evidence that is valued by people from different spaces, different communities. What knowledge looks like to me, as somebody who was born in the UK, raised in Jamaica, and who had a good Rasta upbringing in many ways, is, Rastas used to talk about this idea of in-search. So, kind of knowledge that's in here, so inside out. That knowledge also needs to be held and valued. Sustainable and replicable, enable excluded sectors of society, promote community ownership, and always, always partnership working. So what can you do? Because there's a way when we have these conversations, we can walk away feeling really helpless. So develop clear messages, and this is all of us. Keep an intersectional analysis of gender on the agenda. Work in partnership. Let's have dialogue with our different regulatory bodies. I was really interested in the work that you're doing around the virtual space here. That's amazing. That's something that I really want us in the UK to learn from. Support work in schools that is rights-based, and ensure that prevention is included in all strategies which address violence against women and girls. This is what young people told us in terms of some of the work. People feel more comfortable talking to people their age, their gender. And this, when I heard this, I almost cried. You need to make it cool to not abuse girls, rather than it being cool to abuse girls. Because right now, for many young people, it is cool. One teacher said the male students are far more reflective about the use of violence. This is after an intervention. They think more about it, and the female students are far more self-assured. And this is from a project we've done recently that hasn't yet been evaluated. But this is what one young person said. Helps people open their eyes and see what's going on. We focus on the bigger things, and not small things, which can actually have the biggest effect in life. And a young man said to us, it was actually quite life-changing. And I want all of us to think about what it would look like if we were willing to invest our time or energy in creating work that is life-changing, because that's the game that we're playing. Violence against women and girls is not inevitable. Let's not treat it as if it is. Let's actually work in a way that is all about changing everybody's lives, mine, yours, the next generation. But also, the work is hard, and sometimes it's easy, sometimes we get tired, and the temptation is to give up. And if you're tempted to give up, just think about what that young person said, that it was actually quite life-changing. He feels as if his life has changed. I would ask you to think about what you can do to make sure that that happens. And that's me. So, thank you so much for your time and for having me here and for listening. Thank you.